growing all day and has reached a pitch this afternoon. I'm happy to say that I am joined now by our political editor, Chris Mason. Chris, what do we know?
It looks likely we're going to hear from the Prime Minister relatively soon, and he will tell us that Parliament will be dissolved and that there will be a general election this summer, perhaps at the beginning of July. So we've had a day where, as you were just mentioning, there's been elements of choreography slotting into place where every element could have had a plausible alternative explanation. Cabinet meetings happen every week, usually on a Tuesday rather than a Wednesday, but it was cancelled yesterday because the Prime Minister was abroad. Lots of civil servants saying they were encountering bizarre behaviour from officials in Downing Street, not communicating with them in the way that they would normally expect. And slowly but slowly, the building blocks of a likely announcement started to take place. Now sources emphasising privately that we are probably not many minutes away from that confirmation, after lots of discussions in the heart of government going on for some time about when to go for a general election. It's a quirk, isn't it, of the British electoral system that the power lies with the Prime Minister to pick the date up to a legal backstop beyond which they cannot go. That is at the tail end of January next year. But a Prime Minister holds the power of surprise, and this will be and is going to be a surprise to some. I was going to
say, Chris, because you're very close to this and you've been watching the build-up, but for many people out there, they will be switching the TV on, listening in and wondering, well, where did this come from? Why is he doing it today? You can't see into his mind, but why?
And not only will there be people turning on and asking themselves that question, there are people in this postcode, there are people in this government who themselves are asking that very question, because the indications had been from very senior figures until very recently that it was much more likely to be in the autumn, because the Prime Minister could allow it to happen then. He would be able to guarantee a certain period of time in government before that encounter with the electorate, with an outcome that from his perspective looks shaky as things stand when you look at the opinion polls. Also perhaps a chance for the economy to improve a little further. But there's been others very close to him who have been saying, look, there is a desire out there for a chance to have a say, and if you are seen to put that off, that might make it worse for us. And when they say us, they mean the Conservative Party. So there have been those saying just that in his ear. There are also those around the Prime Minister who've been looking at some of the news of recent weeks. Take, for instance, the inflation news that we were reporting from 7 o'clock this morning. That inflation target, the rate of rises of prices, coming very close to the government's target, down from 11% when Rishi Sunak became Prime Minister. There's other economic indicators are beginning to look a little better, although lots of people watching us now will say, hang on a minute, things still do feel pretty difficult. And the Prime Minister acknowledged that this morning. They have got their flagship Rwanda legislation into law, that idea of sending some migrants to East Africa to try, they hope, and put off people attempting small boat crossings. That hasn't happened yet. That hasn't happened yet. From their perspective, they'd be able to go into the campaign saying that is a clear dividing line with Labour, who have argued that they would stop those flights as quickly as they could if they were to win the general election. And also with those flights not having gone, the argument, which is not yet proven, that that scheme would prove to be a deterrent has not yet been tested. And were it not to prove to be a deterrent, then from the Conservative perspective, maybe it's best that that becomes an argument you make rather than critics potentially being able to point to evidence of the opposite, were that to be the case. Also, what else might have been playing in the minds of people in government tempted to go? Now, it's back to where we started. It's the surprise factor. We've had various moments this year, this calendar year, of speculation. I've been pretty relaxed when my phone has been ringing off the hook at every point prior to today, because it was very easy to establish that it was rubbish, because I would speak to various folk in there and elsewhere and it would be quickly established that no, it wasn't going to happen. What was different today, in fact from last night onwards, is that just wasn't happening, and I could tell that this just felt different, that the conversation, the balance of debate within that building had tilted, had shifted towards wanting to go sooner rather than later. And as I say, there's a surprise element there, because only those in there, a handful of people around the Prime Minister, would know and can make a decision. And for everyone else in government, but most crucially from their perspective in the opposition parties, is guessing and back-timing all of their plans to various theoretical, hypothetical dates, not knowing when you might want to have that manifesto of promises just ready to go. Whether it's a good idea to do a big announcement this week when maybe there's an election announcement coming, or not, because maybe we've got months yet to go. So it has the power of surprise, and it would seem that on that side of the ledger, surprise and where they perceive themselves to have got in the 18 plus months of Rishi Sunak as Prime Minister has led them to think this is the best chance for them. And so it looks like here we go. An extraordinary few weeks ahead.
It is just worth stating for anybody who happens to be switching on, we are here in Downing Street along with many, many others from media outlets. There is an expectation that the Prime Minister is going to make an announcement, and there has been building all day, but we don't yet know exactly whether there'll be an announcement, and if so, what it's going to be. Chris, I just wanted to ask you, you've talked about the economy with better figures today on inflation. You've talked about his pledge to stop the small boats. Would there be, if he were to call an election now, a sort of weighing up on his part, a sort of thinking this is as good as it's going to get?
Yes, I think that is probably ultimately the human rationale that the Prime Minister is likely to have come to as a conclusion. Why do I say that? For two reasons. One is the unshiftable political truth for the Conservative Party and indeed for the Labour Party and others right now, which is that the Conservatives have been in government for 14 years, and that becomes very difficult political headwinds for any government to walk into. Ask Labour in 2010 when they've been in power for 13 years. It becomes very difficult. Not necessarily impossible, the decision will be in the hands of the electorate, but it becomes difficult. And we've seen that reflected in opinion polls and in local and by-election results. There's also a psychological point, I think, here, Reeta, for both the Prime Minister and the Chancellor. They became Prime Minister and Chancellor as a result of one of the most astonishing moments in contemporary British political history, that incredibly short period as Prime Minister that Liz Truss had. Rishi Sunak and Jeremy Hunt, the Chancellor, will have felt in the summer of 2022 that their political careers in all likelihood were over, were finished. They weren't going to serve in a Liz Truss administration. It was a reasonable expectation at the time that she would serve until a general election, maybe beyond it if she was able to win it. They became Prime Minister and Chancellor, the two most commanding figures in British government, almost not by accident, but by a quirk of history. And I think that has informed their approach to the last couple of years, that desire to steady the ship, both economically and politically, in their view to restore the reputation of the UK on the international stage after a period where, quite bluntly, a lot of people had been laughing at the fragility of British politics, and to attempt to give their party the best possible platform for which to go into an election that was almost always going to be very, very difficult for them. That, looking at the opinion polls and recent election results, is true now, as it almost certainly would have been later in the year. So whilst there might have been a temptation to go longer because that allows more time in government and potentially things to brighten a little further economically, predicting the future is a mug's game, and things might politically for them have felt worse. And so it would seem now a racing certainty that after a intense discussion behind that door involving people of different views and different instincts on what is a fine judgment call, attempting to weigh up a range of factors, many of which are quite difficult to extrapolate into the future, that they have concluded for themselves, yes, but perhaps more broadly they'll make an argument for the country too, that now is the right time for a general election.
Chris, we're going to come back to you very shortly. I'm just going to go and let you check your phone. I'm sure you're getting lots of messages and so on. We'll be back with you very shortly. But for the moment, thank you. That was Chris Mason, of course, our political editor. Let's cross to the newsroom now and speak to Hannah White from the Institute for Government, who's in our newsroom for us. Thank you so much for joining us, Hannah. I'm glad you're in the warm and dry on this rather wet May day. Just talk us through what we are likely to see now should the Prime Minister make the announcement that people are expecting. And I have to stress, we don't still quite know, but what would be the protocol?
So what we would expect is the Prime Minister to come out in maybe the next few minutes, the next hour or so, and make an announcement to say that he is planning, he either has already spoken to the King or he's planning to go to the palace to ask for a dissolution of Parliament in order to hold a general election. Normally what would happen is Parliament would continue to sit for a few days in order to deal with the legislation which is currently going through the House. There's still 16 government bills, which obviously in an ideal world the government would like to see become law, and so there'll be what's called a wash-up, where they talk to the opposition parties and try to speed some of that legislation onto the statute book. Then the expectation would be that if you had a election, people are saying that that would be on the 4th of July, then you would need to have dissolved Parliament by Thursday next week. At that point, all MPs cease to become MPs. They've just become candidates standing for election, and we will be into the general election campaign.
And just to explain, Hannah, why is it the 4th of July that people are talking about?
I think people are talking about the 4th of July just on the basis of when the announcement is being made, the fact that you will need a few days for wash-up for Parliament to conclude its business. And the fact is that if you factor in Thursday next week as being the last day on which Parliament might sit, it's 25 days for an election campaign, 25 working days before the election would then be held. And I think the reasoning people are thinking of is that that would be before at least English schools break up for the holidays, although not Scottish schools. They will have already finished for the summer. But there are obviously lots of different calculations that go into picking an election date, as Chris has been saying.
And Hannah, I don't know if you had an opportunity to listen to Chris Mason, our political editor, who was saying that he listens to people, he reads the runes, and he often dismisses speculation of election talk. But it's simply that people have been responding differently in the last few hours, particularly amongst the civil service. What would change in a civil servant's behaviour if there's an expectation of a general election?
Well, of course, the civil service has to be very careful when they actually get into an election campaign to make sure that nothing they do can be perceived as working on behalf of the government at that point in order to promote the government's interests, because government MPs just become candidates for election at that point. But I think what Chris will have been referring to is examples of meetings being cancelled, some ministers seeming to cut short their international travel. And really, for me, the persuasive thing has been the absence of denial, because we all have examples, and Gordon Brown is the famous one, of prime ministers who allowed speculation about an election being called to run riot, and then didn't call an election. And I think prime ministers are now very cognizant of the fact that they need to shut down that sort of speculation quickly if they're not going to call an election. And we haven't had, Rishi Sunak had a prime opportunity to do that at Prime Minister's questions today, and he answered in a way which did not shut down the speculation.
Yes, indeed, and that was sort of resounding in its silence, wasn't it? Hannah, thank you very much indeed. And I should just explain to people watching, people who know about broadcasting from Downing Street will hear the music. There's not a party going on, there's a protest going on, so that's what you'll be hearing in the background. We can speak now to Chris Wilkins, who was Downing Street Head of Strategy when Theresa May was Prime Minister. Hello, good afternoon to you, Chris. Thanks so much for joining us. You will have been there at the heart of government, watching what was going on while Theresa May was making her decision to call a general election. What sort of things do Prime Ministers take into account?
Well, it's precisely a number of things. I was there during 2017 when we went through exactly this process. We got the cabinet together, announced it to the cabinet. Of course, the Prime Minister doesn't have to do that technically, but of course you get your team round, you tell them and then you go out and announce it. It looks like that's what's happening now. And you take into account a variety of things. How will the opposition respond? What is it that they're going to say? Will they be on the back foot? Is one thing. You have to take into account what's going on in the country. It was just mentioned, for example, that July 4th, if that is to be the date, does fall before the English school holidays, not the Scottish ones, but the English ones. You have to take into account things like that. How will the country be feeling? What will be going on? And then the other thing is what's going on in Parliament, because the moment you call an election, you have to then go into a process that's called wash-up, and that's kind of what legislation is going through Parliament that we really need to land and get on the books, and can we get that through before Parliament then rises for the campaign? And that is an important thing, because sometimes there's some things that you think, actually, this piece of legislation is really critical, we can't afford to drop it, so we need to get it through. So there's a whole host of things you have to think about before you make the call.
Chris, please do just stay on the line. I want to bring in another Chris, Chris Mason, our political editor, who has got another line to report.
Yeah, I can tell you, Reeta, that at 5 o'clock, so in around 15 minutes, we are expecting, although whether the weather might interfere, let's see, the Prime Minister to address us in Downing Street with the expectation that he will be calling a summer general election. So the expectation is that we are moments away from a lectern moment when a Prime Minister comes out and addresses us. As I say, I wonder if the weather might tempt them to do it inside, but we shall see. Usually the expectation is that that lectern appears just behind us, and to make an obvious point, but it's worth making it on a day like this, Prime Ministers only do this kind of thing when they are making announcements of significant gravity, and that announcement is going to be that a general election is on its way.
Thank you very much indeed. So, Chris Wilkins, perhaps I can come back to you. You heard Chris Mason there saying that we can now report that there will be a lectern out here, probably in Downing Street, out in the street. Could it be something else? We don't absolutely know what it is. Could it be a different announcement?
I think it would be shocking at this stage if it were. I suppose there are maybe a handful of things that it could be. But I think the moment that you saw earlier today that Foreign Secretary was being called back from his trip and that Defence Secretary was being asked to delay his foreign travel, the moment you saw those two things, it began to crystallise that this was clearly what was going to happen. And then it really became, is the Prime Minister going to come out and call a general election for July the 4th? Well, there was some speculation about whether he would come out and call an election, but actually set the date for later in the year, which would be unusual, but there would be arguments in favour. But it does seem now like it's going to be July the 4th. And the point about the lectern moment, and this is really critical, is because it's the moment that the Prime Minister gets to frame what he wants the general election to be about. And it's the kind of one moment right at the start where it's on your terms and you come out and you say, I'm going to call a general election, and this is what that election's about. And the framing battle about a general election campaign is all important. The person who wins the framing and sets what the question is about generally gets a good outcome at the end of the campaign period. So this, what we're going to see now, it sounds like, over the next half an hour or so, is really absolutely critical for Rishi Sunak.
And Chris, there had been some speculation that he might perhaps say something at Prime Minister's questions, but he batted that one away pretty rapidly. And that is because, as you say, he wants his moment here by himself, looking prime ministerial in Downing Street.
That's right. But he did say something interesting, actually, which I thought did slightly give the game away at Prime Minister's questions. In answer to a different question, he used a line where he talked about the Conservatives providing security for the United Kingdom and a secure future for the United Kingdom. And it sounded to me like that was an election slogan that had been agreed. If you remember, he made a speech just last week, on Monday of last week, which was all about the future is insecure. There's lots happening in the world. It's quite a fragile place. And trying to make the argument that in that world, actually, the Conservative government is the best one to sort of steward the country through. And he draws on, what he did as Chancellor during COVID, etc. And that's kind of what he wanted. So when he used that line earlier, I thought, well, that's interesting, because that actually is the slogan that he wants to talk about. So yes, he wants this moment clean now in Downing Street to say to the country, down the barrel of the camera, we're going to have a general election, and this is what I think it is about. And if you agree with it, that's what you think it's about, you need to vote for me. And it's a very rare opportunity to get that moment to talk directly to the country and to frame an issue in those terms.
Chris, how much, assuming that he is going to come out and make the announcement that everybody is assuming that he is calling a general election, how much of his strategy will be in place? You've talked about policies, you've talked about the key points that he'll want to hit in order to frame the election, but how much more will have been worked out on top of that?
So, absolutely, they will have worked out at least a skeleton of what the next few weeks look like in terms of stories. So, generally, what you're doing going into a campaign like this is the first few days is all about that framing piece. Every visit, every media opportunity, every statement is about saying, remember, we're having a general election, it's about this. For Boris Johnson, if you remember, that was, we're having a general election to get Brexit done. And by the end of the campaign, everyone thought that was what the election was about. Boris Johnson won. So they'll spend the first few days doing that. Then they'll have gridded out on this big grid a sense of the next few weeks, what announcements they want to make, what are the sort of policy for the manifesto that they want to land, and how that brings the thing to life, how it brings the main theme to life. They will have some sense of that. Now, of course, events will happen. The other parties will have their view on that, but they will have a sense of the big policy ideas for the manifesto that they've been working on in recent months, so how they land those. And then the other thing is that they will have a very clear sense, to a very granular level, of the seats that they think are in play, the seats they think they've won already, where they don't have to campaign, but the seats that are in play where they think they need to really target. And that will, of course, be the basis for where the Prime Minister goes, where the Cabinet go, where resources are put in it, where the media are targeted, all of that sort of stuff. All of that groundwork has been done by the campaign team. It's all sort of ready to go. And so it's then rolling out the ground campaign to try and get out the vote in the core seats that matter to them. Well, I think they're well prepped. I think Labour are well prepped as well. I'm sure the other parties are. But by making an announcement today, if indeed that's what he does do in the next few minutes, as we now expect, he's just stealing the march. And it's the prerogative of the Prime Minister to have this element of surprise, just to get one ahead of the other parties and be able to start that process quickly. And so that's kind of the opportunity he has now in the next hour or so.
So good to talk to you, really fascinating. Thank you so much. That's Chris Wilkins there, former head of strategy for the former Prime Minister Theresa May. For anybody just tuning in and joining us now, you're watching a BBC special. We are waiting for the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, to make an announcement. We're told that a lectern is going to be set up. We are assuming here in Downing Street, although as you can see, it is very wet, very soggy. It's possible that this happens inside Downing Street as well, but we are expecting a statement from the Prime Minister at 5 o'clock, and speculation is rife that he will be calling a general election. Well, while we wait, I'm happy to say we can speak to the chief leader writer for the Observer newspaper and former Labour advisor, Sonia Sota. Hi there, Sonia. Thank you so much for joining us. So, well, Labour has been saying for many weeks now, bring it on. So will they be pleased?
Apologies about that. Hopefully you can hear me now.
I can't hear you. Are you muted?
Can you hear
Yes,
me now?
marvellous. Yes, go ahead.
Wonderful.
Yes.
Sorry about that. So I was just going to say that I think in Labour HQ, the feeling will be one of absolute delight. As you just hinted at there, they've been preparing to be on an election footing for some weeks and months now. And in fact, it's believed that some of the rumours about an early general election actually originated from Labour itself, where you've got election chiefs, basically warning shadow cabinet members, it could come at any point. You need to be ready. So, I think Labour wanted the election to be sooner rather than later. So if it does turn out it's on Thursday, the 4th of July, there will be a feeling of delight.
And Sir Keir Starmer, of course, made that, what felt very much like the beginning of an election campaign appearance just a few days ago.
Yes, that's right. I think last week it actually felt like we didn't know when the general election was going to be. And, last week I was thinking it was most likely to be towards the end of the year. But we really had a moment where it felt like both party leaders were launching their long general election campaign. You had Rishi Sunak give a speech and say, well, this is a security election. And then you had Keir Starmer come out and launch that pledge card. Very strong focus on the economy, on the NHS and public services, which is actually where we know the public are going to be. So I think we can expect in this general election campaign for both parties, to sort of not just be fighting over the issues, but be determined to keep the election campaign on the issues that they think they perform most strongly on. That's why you had Sunak, the Prime Minister, sort of trying to make it a general election about international affairs and international security. The problem for him is that when you ask the public about what they care about, it's consistently things like the economy and the NHS are coming on top. And those are issues where Labour are way out ahead on.
I should just say to people who are watching, we are expecting an announcement by the Prime Minister, but I am being advised that there might be some delay, partly because of the weather. As you can see, lovely May British weather here. You can hear the rain coming down. And there isn't a lectern out there, a podium out there at the moment. So do stay tuned, because we will bring you the news as soon as it comes. There is still very heightened speculation that we'll be hearing from the Prime Minister very soon. In fact, it's been confirmed that we will, but that 5 o'clock time might have slipped. Sonia, you were talking, in fact, I'm being told, it's very febrile here. I was being told that a lectern was coming out, but it's a PA system. Sorry about that. These things will happen. Sonia, you were talking about Labour wanting to fight on public services, but this will now be a moment of truth for Labour, won't it? They're very significantly ahead in the polls, but they have been criticised repeatedly for not being detailed enough in terms of their policies, in terms of their figures, and in terms of costing. That's all going to have to change now.
Well, there's certainly going to be more scrutiny on Labour and their set of policies as we move forward to an election. I mean, that's exactly what you'd expect. Labour, though, have played a very cautious strategy, I think, which is, they're saying that they've tied themselves to the same macroeconomic rules that the Conservative have on spending and on debt. And that means that they've got limited headroom to do the things that they'd like to do. You've had very, very careful messaging from Labour's Shadow Chancellor Rachel Reeves. The Labour leadership is very clear that anything they say they're going to do that costs money, they will have fully costed, and they will say where that money is coming from. So, for example, the extra bits of spending that you've got on the NHS, the extra spending on teachers, for schools, they say that's all accounted for in terms of, specific small bits of tax rises, for example, that would hit companies, for example, particular companies. So, there is policy, and I expect that we can hear more of it. But it's certainly true that there's been a lot of Labour strategists behind the scenes have been concerned that there could be some softening of the Labour lead during a general election campaign as kind of people start to make their mind up. I think the thing is, when you're 20 points ahead in the polls, obviously your strategists are going to be concerned about that. But that is a very, very healthy lead to be going into a general election campaign on.
And yet, just picking up on something that you said there, things will improve under Labour, but there's only limited scope for improvement. I mean, that's not a great message, is it?
Well, I think the message that Labour are trying to sort of put forwards for the electorate is that these are really difficult circumstances. These are difficult circumstances. If they win an election, there'll be difficult circumstances to be inheriting, and that's because when you look at the economy, they're very much, there are long-standing issues with productivity, with growth, with stagnating wages. We've had very high rates of inflation, high price rises baked into the economy. Even though that's come down, we've seen, prices increase by 20% since 2021. So if people are feeling they are not feeling well off when they're looking at their own family budgets. And Labour have got kind of the same situation when they're looking at national spending and tax revenues and what they're going to have to do. So, you know, I think some of what Labour is saying is quite cautious in the sense that they're saying that we can't, you know, they're a change Labour Party. We're not going to go into a general election in 2019 promising the kinds of things that Jeremy Corbyn did at the last general election. I think the hope on the Labour side will be that that's kind of a realistic pitch and that the country wants change, but they also don't want kind of, you know, politicians, they're not in the mood for politicians to be promising them something that they see as magical thinking that they don't believe can be delivered.
Always good to talk to you. Thank you so much. That's Sonia Sother there, writer for The Observer newspaper and former Labour advisor. Thank you so much. Can I bring in Chris Mason once again? Chris, I think you were saying there might be some delay because of the weather. Maybe there is, but the rain is easing off, so perhaps.
The rain is easing off, and if the sun hasn't quite come out, it feels a little brighter than it did a few minutes ago, albeit it seemed to be getting worse, didn't it, a few minutes ago. Sounds trivial, that, but it'll matter, and it'll matter in there because
he wants it to look.
Yeah, because this is a moment where you're talking to the archive as a Prime Minister. In other words, it's something that gets played over and over again. It's a chapter in your own story, if you like, as a Prime Minister, as part of the country's story. Just to explain what's been going on in the street as you were in the middle of that conversation there, we're seeing elements of the choreography of this moment taking shape. Just below my left foot, just beyond the camera shot, is a giant speaker, so we'll be able to hear the Prime Minister's words. In fact, a wire is about to be attached to the back of it, which will make that possible. I think fairly soon we will see that lectern appear, and then shortly after that, hear from the Prime Minister. Things often slip, so the expectation was we'd be hearing from him at 5 o'clock. It is now, 3 minutes past? I suspect we'll probably, and I'm guessing now, 10 minutes or so away at least, given the time it takes to set things up and test the equipment. But all of that is detail. Where we are this evening is on the brink of a general election campaign, where the power will depart this street. This street is all about power. It's about where power resides, and it resides behind that black door in the hands of the Prime Minister. And what we will hear from the Prime Minister is the moment where that power heads out, and it heads out into the hands of the electorate, millions of people making individual decisions that shape how we are governed. And of course, between this point and the point that polling stations open, there will be a wall of noise, a huge amount of persuasion. We will hear, won't we, about promises and manifestos and track records and parties setting out their own case and trying to destroy their opponents' cases. We'll see general election debates. We'll see missteps from the various parties. We'll see records challenged, argued passionately for, trashed by rivals. And then ultimately that sense that, yes, power will be handed to the electorate. And for all of the noise and cynicism and scepticism that can so often wash around politics, we should never forget the significance of this moment. That fact that power will be in the hands of the electorate to make a profound decision about how we're governed for up to the next 5 years. And we're just moments away from that official starting gun being fired.
So Chris, you've stood here in Downing Street so many times over the last few years for announcements like this, and it strikes me that this is 14 years to the month since the Conservatives came into power, since David Cameron became the largest party and then spent time negotiating with Nick Clegg.
Indeed so, yeah. And you think of what has happened over those 14 years, a period of coalition government for the first time in a very long time, where there was a strand of conversation from the likes of you and me that perfectly reasonably in the early days questioned how stable it would be. Turned out it was a very stable government that lasted its whole term, perhaps more stable than the government that went before it and the government that came after it. Of course, we had all of the noise of the Brexit arguments that tore the Conservative Party into plenty of pieces, divided the country, and redefined how people even articulated their own political outlook. For so long, people defining themselves so often as Leavers or Remainers rather than via any other badge of political affiliation. And then that moment of nearly 5 years ago, with Boris Johnson securing that very significant majority, where all of the talk then was an expectation that he had the opportunity potentially to govern for up to 10 years. They thought that it would be too big a challenge for a Labour Party that had suffered its worst general election result since 1935 to possibly haul itself back into competitiveness, let alone the prospect of a potential victory in just one parliamentary term. And yet here we are on the brink of a general election campaign where Labour feel confident, they are determined not to be complacent, but you look at the polling evidence and recent electoral records, and Labour believe they have grounds to be confident, and plenty of Conservatives, as we embark on the weeks to come, do anticipate defeat. But we can put that to one side. That's the backdrop. That's the conversation that will go on amongst folk like me in the next 5 or 6 weeks. But again, the power lies with the people. People will decide, and campaigns can make a difference. Just ask Theresa May. She thought, back in 2017, that she took a look at the opinion polls, thought a sizable majority would be useful in trying to deliver Brexit, called a general election, and the electorate thought otherwise. The campaign went in a different way from how many had anticipated it. The opinion polls shrivelled from a very wide margin to next to nothing, and the result was a huge surprise. Again, an indication. You can just never tell.
Stay there a moment, Chris. I know that some people will be wondering what the sound behind me is. It's just stopped, but I just want to show you there are protests that are going on just outside the Downing Street gates, and there they are starting up again. And this is just something that is part of the backdrop to broadcasting from Downing Street. Chris, if I can just bring you back in. Rishi Sunak will have had many things to consider. But while we can't see into his mind, of course, his legacy will be one of them. Yeah. And that will presumably be partly why he's going today, if indeed he is.
His legacy, as far as his place in history, as in the widest sense, as a Prime Minister, but then also a legacy within the Conservative Party. And that's been part of the tussle that's been going on privately amongst those closest to Rishi Sunak about when to go for an election. Clearly and perfectly rationally, from the perspective of a Prime Minister, he wants to do that at the point where they collectively judge he gives himself the best chance of doing as well as he possibly can. And there have been senior Conservatives saying to him that the fear from their perspective was waiting any longer could make what they fear might be for them a bad situation worse, and therefore it could be in the interests of the party to go sooner. Now, the more negative interpretation of that from plenty privately is about, from their perspective, minimising the scale of defeat. But again, as I say, I don't seek to be presumptive, because again, that will be up to the electorate and up for the campaigners to make their arguments in the next 5 or 6 weeks. But that's at the heart of the conversation that's been going on, and yeah, he will have had an eye to that. And concluding, it would seem that of all of the dates that he could have picked to come out and talk to the country from the lectern, that of all of the dates between now and pretty much December the 17th, I think it is, that this, from his perspective, is the best time. The 17th is
the last day that he
I think that's the last time where Parliament would effectively automatically dissolve, and it would happen a period of weeks later at the end of January. Up until that point, he has the power to make the decision. Beyond that point, it would happen anyway.
Chris, no sooner did I say it stopped raining than it started raining, and your glasses are rather wet. So I'll just let you get under an umbrella for a little while. Don't go too far away. We'll be back to you very shortly. Chris Mason there, of course, our political editor. I'd like to go back to the newsroom and speak to Hannah White again from the Institute for Government. And Hannah, you've watched these things over many years. Talk to us a little bit about the choreography of calling an election.
Well, the key thing, as Chris was saying there, is for the Prime Minister to keep his deliberations very private between him and a very small trusted group, and really not to allow that information to leak before time. And I think Rishi Sunak's done a very successful job. If he is calling an election today, it's really only late last night, early this morning, that speculation started to really gather pace.
Hannah, I just want to cut into you because there is a great deal of commotion here, not because of the Prime Minister, but because of the lectern. So confirmation, if it were needed, that he will in fact be here very shortly. So lots of calls from photographers who want it right in front of them, of course, and we've got PA systems roundabout behind us. So a great sense of sort of expectation here in Downing Street, as you might expect. Okay, sorry to focus on an inanimate object there, but it is partly a sign that this is going to happen. Please, Hannah, please do pick up again. You were talking about the choreography.
Lectern is very important. No, so what then happens once the decision's been made? The Prime Minister has to ask the King, it's the royal prerogative, to actually dissolve Parliament, and having been given that permission by the King, then the election date can be set. Also the date of when a Parliament would meet again after an election can be set. And then it's really just a question of Parliament concluding its business, the government and the opposition parties getting together, looking at what legislation is going through, and agreeing the wash-up period, what legislation is going to get onto the statute book. Some bills might get gutted, controversial bits cut out, other bits going through. The Prime Minister, I think, will be very hopeful that his tobacco and vapes bill gets through, and that's relatively has some cross-party agreement, so that's quite likely. There's a finance bill that needs to go through. There are some other more controversial bills that might not make it. Then Parliament gets dissolved, and really that's the point at which the short campaign starts properly. We would expect for a July 4th election that to happen next Thursday. And then you get into the election campaign at some point, normally sort of 18 to 20 days out from the election. You see the manifestos published by the parties. It's a bit variable. Often the opposition will try to go first with their manifesto to steal a bit of the limelight from the government, but again that's very much up to them. And then we would be going up to the 4th of July. Of course, the other thing that will be going on is in government, the civil service working very quickly to try to work out what needs to be done before Parliament is resolved, whether there are any public appointments or big decisions that they need to be made, which couldn't be made during the used to be called the Purdah period, when the civil service can't be making big decisions of that kind. So there's a big sort of clearing up exercise.
And Hannah, would it be right to say that we've been in a particularly general election rich era in the last few years? There was one in 2015, 17, 19 and now. How unusual is that?
I mean, that is pretty unusual. When you think back to 2010, and we had the Fixed Term Parliaments Act introduced as part of the coalition agreement at the start of that Parliament, and we thought at that time that we were set for a period of elections every 5 years, that would become a sort of steady drumbeat, that it was no longer up to the Prime Minister to determine when elections should happen. But of course, that reckoned without Brexit, reckoned without the
Here
need.
He is,
that,
Hannah. Here he is.
Is here.
In the last 5 years, our country has fought through the most challenging times since the Second World War. As I stand here as your Prime Minister, I can't help but reflect that my first proper introduction to you was just over 4 years ago. I stood behind one of the podiums, upstairs in the building behind me. I told you that we faced a generation-defining moment, and that we as a society would not be judged by some government action, but by the small acts of kindness that we showed one another. You met that challenge, and then some, and I have never been prouder to be British. And when I introduced the furlough scheme, I did so not because I saw a country simply in need of desperate help, albeit we were, but because I saw a country whose future hung in the balance. I could be bold and trust in the tens of millions of you at home that you would rise to the moment, or I could accept the inevitable millions of job losses and pick up the pieces. In truth, it was no choice at all. I have never and will never leave the people of this country to face the darkest of days alone, and you know that because you've seen it. As I did then, I will forever do everything in my power to provide you with the strongest possible protection I can. That is my promise to you. Because for so many of us, it's easy to forget the scale of what we've been through. We were hit by a pandemic that upended normal life. Who would have thought that the government would ever tell us how many times a day we could leave our homes? Then, just as we were recovering from COVID, war returned to Europe, with Putin's invasion of Ukraine sending your energy bills spiraling. I came to office, above all, to restore economic stability. Economic stability is the bedrock of any future success, whether that is rising wages and good jobs, investment in our public services, or the defence of the country. And because of our collective sacrifice and your hard work, we have reached two major milestones in delivering that stability, showing that when we work together, anything is possible. Our economy is now growing faster than anyone predicted, outpacing Germany, France, and the United States. And this morning it was confirmed that inflation is back to normal. This means that the pressure on prices will ease and mortgage rates will come down. This is proof that the plan and priorities I set out are working. I recognise that it has not always been easy. Some of you will only just be starting to feel the benefits, and for some, it might still be hard when you look at your bank balance. But this hard-earned economic stability was only ever meant to be the beginning. The question now is how, and who do you trust to turn that foundation into a secure future for you, your family, and our country. Now is the moment for Britain to choose its future, to decide whether we want to build on the progress we have made or risk going back to square one with no plan and no certainty. Earlier today, I spoke with His Majesty the King to request the dissolution of Parliament. The King has granted this request, and we will have a general election on the 4th of July. This election will take place at a time when the world is more dangerous than it has been since the end of the Cold War. Putin's Russia is waging a brutal war in Ukraine and will not stop there if he succeeds. That war has also made it all too clear the risk to our energy security. In the Middle East, the forces of Islamist extremism threaten regional and ultimately global stability. These tensions are exploited by extremists who seek to undermine our values and divide our society here at home. China is looking to dominate the 21st century by stealing a lead in technology. And migration is being weaponized by hostile states to threaten the integrity of our borders. These uncertain times call for a clear plan and bold action to chart a course to a secure future. You must choose in this election who has that plan, who is prepared to take the bold action necessary to secure a better future for our country and our children. Now, I cannot and will not claim that we have got everything right. No government should. But I am proud of what we have achieved together, the bold actions we have taken, and I'm confident about what we can do in the future. We've tackled inflation, controlled debt, cut workers' taxes, and increased the state pension by £900. We've reduced taxes on investment and seized the opportunities of Brexit to make this the best country in the world to grow a business. Put record amounts of funding into our NHS and ensured it is now training the doctors and nurses it needs in the decades to come. We've reformed education, and our children are now the best readers in the Western world. We prioritised energy security and your family finances over environmental dogma in our approach to net zero. We fully funded an increase in defence spending to 2.5% of GDP. We made a decision to invest more in local transport that you actually use, rather than endlessly plough more money into HS2. We set out a comprehensive plan to reform our welfare system, to make it fair for those who pay for it as well as those who need it. Immigration is finally coming down, and we are stopping the boats with our Rwanda partnership. And we will ensure that the next generation grows up smoke-free. I hope that my work since I became Prime Minister shows that we have a plan and are prepared to take bold action necessary for our country to flourish. Now, I've stuck with that plan and always been honest with you about what is needed, even when that's been difficult. Because I'm guided by doing what is right for our country, not what is easy. Now, I can't say the same thing for the Labour Party, because I don't know what they offer. And in truth, I don't think you know either. And that's because they have no plan. There is no bold action. And as a result, the future can only be uncertain with them. On the 5th of July, either Keir Starmer or I will be Prime Minister. He has shown time and time again that he will take the easy way out and do anything to get power. If he was happy to abandon all the promises he made to become Labour leader once he got the job, how can you know that he won't do exactly the same thing if he were to become Prime Minister? If you don't have the conviction to stick to anything you say, if you don't have the courage to tell people what you want to do, and if you don't have a plan, how can you possibly be trusted to lead our country, especially at this most uncertain of times? Over the next few weeks, I will fight for every vote. I will earn your trust, and I will prove to you that only a Conservative government led by me will not put our hard-earned economic stability at risk, can restore pride and confidence in our country, and with a clear plan and bold action, will deliver a secure future for you, your family, and our United Kingdom.
There we have it. There we have it. The statement from the Prime Minister that everybody has been waiting for, made, as you saw, in the pouring rain. Possibly it became the worst kept secret in Westminster. The Prime Minister there confirming a general election for Thursday, July the 4th. I'm joined by our Deputy Political Editor, Vicky Young, who was listening to everything. So, Vicky, some very clear themes emerging there from what he said.
Yeah, and I think security being the really big one there. You might remember that last week, Rishi Sunak made a speech about security, and last week really started to feel a bit like a general election campaign as he laid out those themes. But that is what he and the Conservative Party are going to focus on. They're going to talk about security, about the risk to the country, and he will argue that he has helped people through difficult times. You'll hear a lot about that because the Conservative record is patchy. They know that. There's a reason why they are so far behind in the opinion polls. What they will the argument they will make is that we've been through a difficult time. We've had a pandemic. We've had the Russian invasion of Ukraine. All of these have put huge pressures on the country, and he will say that as Chancellor first with the furlough scheme, and since then he has helped people at a very difficult time, and he will try to contrast that with Labour, and he will say they have no plan. Now there's a challenge here for Labour, definitely. Sir Keir Starmer is still, he's the leader of the opposition, of course. That's not the same as when you've been through a general election campaign and people start to know you better. He will have to introduce himself again to the British people, Sir Keir Starmer, and lay out what a Labour government would do. And what the Tories will try and do is say that they don't have a plan, that they don't have policies, that people have no idea what they will do. And I think you can see that framing very quickly there from the outset.
So a few things struck me, Vicky. He spoke initially about challenging times, about generation-defining times, and kindness, and he linked that to his own role as Chancellor with the furlough scheme, reminding people for whom the COVID days may be far distant of the role that he played.
Yeah, that's right. That was a huge step for him. He was, a very junior minister, really, and he's had a meteoric rise, to Chancellor, and then, of course, now to Prime Minister, and wants to remind people how the Conservative government helped them. Now, of course, that's without mentioning the other things that went on during COVID and all sorts of questions that were asked, of course, during Boris Johnson's time about Partygate that went on here. The Cabinet now leaving here, just as you can see, I don't know if you can see those pictures there, through the pouring rain, Mel Stride there in the middle, the Work and Pensions Secretary. And worth saying, Reeta, that there is shock amongst Tory MPs, actually, about all of this. I was over in the House of Commons as these rumours were circulating, and when you said, look, it looks like a general election's on, they couldn't really believe it, because for so many of them, they know that that's it for them. Lots of them have said they're standing down. Lots of them know they will lose their seats. I think they all thought it was going to be the autumn, because they're wondering, well, what's changed since he didn't have an election in May at the same time as the locals, and then he's now saying July the 4th. What has changed in that time? They all felt that by not going in May, it was going to be in the autumn. So I think they're quite surprised that it's happened. And also a Prime Minister calling an election when they are so far behind in the opinion polls, when they don't have to, is very, very unusual. I mean, John Major's the nearest equivalent that we have really in recent times, back back in 1997, but he was running out of time. He held it right at the end of that parliament. You know, Rishi Sunak doesn't have to do this election until January next year, but he's decided to go now. And I think there'll be lots of people speculating about why he's decided to do that, presumably because he doesn't think that things are going to improve in the short term enough to change the dial. I think there's lots of Tory MPs frustrated, actually. He's announced various measures. None of it seems to have shifted those opinion polls. So obviously he's now decided that it's the time to go. But it does leave a lot of Tory MPs, of course, looking at the end of their careers.
Vicky, don't go very far away. I just want to bring in Professor Sir John Curtis from the University of Strathclyde, who of course looks at the election prospects and figures for us every year. Good to have you on the programme, Sir John. So just speaking to Vicky's point there, a lot of shock amongst Tory MPs given where the Conservatives are in the polls. Just spell out for us the challenge for the main parties now that we are about to enter a general election campaign.
Well, the truth is the Conservative Party do face a major challenge. As you've said, it's a challenge not dissimilar to that John Major faced in 1997, but Mr Major did almost go all the way to the legal limit of that parliament. On average, in the polls that have been conducted so far this month, the Labour Party on 44% are 21 points ahead of the Conservatives on 23 points. That is an enormous figure to turn around, particularly if you bear in mind that even if the polls narrow and maybe we get into the area of a hung parliament, which perhaps is at the top end of reasonable expectations for the Conservatives at the moment, because neither the Liberal Democrats nor the Scottish National Party are willing to vote for a minority Conservative King's Speech, the Conservatives have to get themselves almost way back to 326 if Rishi Sunak is going to remain the tenant of 10 Downing Street. So it is a very, very substantial challenge. For the other parties, well, the Liberal Democrats are running on average in the polls at around 10-11%, no better than they were back in 2019, but they are hoping to profit from Conservative misfortune in those constituencies where they start off in second place. One of the challenges that the Conservative Party now faces, in which in a sense things have got more difficult for them in the last 6 months, is that actually the party that is now picking up most votes from the Conservatives is not Labour but Reform. They're running at 11 or 12% in the polls. And here we should remember Reform, i.e. the Brexit Party, did not stand in Conservative-held constituencies back in 2019. If Richard Tice sticks to his determination to do so this time, then even if Reform votes get squeezed during the campaign, they're getting 5 or 6%. That's going to be 5 or 6% often off the Conservative total in the very seats they're trying to defend. The Greens will be hopeful. They've had their best parliament so far as the opinion polls are concerned. They're running at 7%, and they've got 1 or 2 constituencies they've got their eye on, although of course Caroline Lucas is standing down in Brighton. North of the border, I think the Scottish National Party will not welcome this early election. They have just replaced their leader. John Swinney is hoping to turn things around. And at the moment, the Scottish National Party is running about 5 or 6 points behind Labour in the polls north of the border. So the truth is, this just looks like an election for Labour to win. And I guess there are almost 2 words that come to mind so far as the Prime Minister's decision is concerned, is he's either very brave or extremely foolhardy. And we will discover in the early hours of the 5th of July which of those judgments prove to be correct.
And Sir John, you speak about Labour being so far ahead in the polls, and yet they go on talking about not being complacent. And there are electoral changes as well, aren't there? There are boundary changes.
Yes.
Does that make it more difficult for Labour?
The boundary changes do make it somewhat more difficult for Labour. So whereas on the standard arithmetic we all use, and I'll come back to that in a moment, the Labour Party needed around a 12-point lead over the Conservatives to get a majority of 1 on the old boundaries. That figure looks now more like 13 to 14%. So the boundary review has made things a little bit more difficult for Labour, but not dramatically so. However, one of the challenges that faces the Conservatives is that both those so-called MRP polls, those big polls where you interview a lot of people and then statisticians attempt to model the change in party support to estimate what's going to happen in the constituencies. Or if you look at the local elections just 2 or 3 weeks ago, a clear pattern in both is that the Conservative vote is falling more heavily in places where they were previously strongest. And that, under our electoral system, is potentially very bad news indeed. In other words, it means that for any given share of the vote, the Conservatives are at risk of losing more seats than we'd otherwise expect. And an electoral system that was very kind to them back in 2019 and enabled Boris Johnson to get his overall majority of 80. If the local elections are any guide and the opinion polls are any guide, there is now a risk that the electoral system will be nothing like as kind to the Conservatives this time. Much the same, by the way, was the case back in 1997 when the Conservatives faced a not dissimilar situation and with their vote falling away quite heavily.
OK, always good to talk to you, Sir John. Thank you very much indeed. I'm going to go very shortly to a former Downing Street advisor, but I just want to bring Vicky Young back in, our deputy political editor, because, of course, lots of people contacting you, Vicky, given the announcement. What are you hearing?
Yeah, so this is about the choreography, actually, of what happens next. So from Downing Street, this has come out. The Prime Minister, as we heard, has asked the King to proclaim the dissolution of Parliament. His Majesty has done that and will comply with that request. So that means Parliament will be prorogued on Friday the 24th, that's this Friday. Dissolution will take place on Thursday the 30th of May. So it was supposed to be recess. It's half term for many schools next week. That's gone in terms of Parliament. They will do as many bits of legislation as they can get through in that short time. The general election, as we know, on Thursday the 4th of July. The new Parliament will be summoned to meet on Tuesday the 9th of July. First thing they do then is elect a speaker, they swear in members, and the state opening will be on Wednesday the 17th of July. And then just one other thing, in terms of response from Labour, there hasn't been anything official yet, apart from Angela Rayner, the deputy leader of the Labour Party, seen walking through the building across the road saying, "Bring it on." And that tweet gone out saying the same thing from Rachel Reeves, the Shadow Chancellor.
Vicky, thank you very much. Back with you shortly, and lots of dates for our diaries there. Thank you very much. Well, as I said, I want to go now to back to John Curtis. I beg your pardon. We're going to speak now to Mo Hussein, who is a former Downing Street advisor and a press office advisor. Mo, good to have you on the programme. You're watching Rishi Sunak there. What did you think about the presentation and what he had to say?
Well, there's been a lot of rumbling about this today, and Number 10 weren't doing very much from the communication side to try and lock it down, which in itself is quite telling. And I think there's been a big debate around, do you go long or do you go earlier, as we've seen now? And looking at the economic data the government's had recently, whether it's inflation stats or a bit more growth that we saw last week, considering migration starts coming out tomorrow, potentially the first flight to Rwanda, it feels like there's a choreography of slightly better news for the government that they can probably capitalise on more rather than perhaps wait and potentially squander. I think that has been the debate behind the scenes, and clearly the people who want to move quickly seem to have won the argument.
And in terms of what he had to say, what did you take away from that? The framing of the way in which he wants this campaign to run?
Yeah, I thought it was interesting because the Prime Minister doesn't have many cards that he can play. You know, he made these 5 big commitments, but the one that is closest to being met on inflation, we saw the outcome of that today. So I think him saying, look, we're not saying everything is perfect, the job hasn't been fully completed, but I've shown you that I can make these changes. Playing the safety first card, stick with me, rather than throwing it all to the wind and risking another change. I think that's probably the strongest card he has. And that's what we will hear a lot more from as well. It was also interesting that he spoke about his previous role as Chancellor. That's when he really connected with the country in a very, very different way, not least with the furlough scheme, when he was paying people's wages for quite a long period of time. And he was much more popular personally than he is now. So I think looking back to that time and reminding people of his role then was telling. And again, that would be a recurring theme. With that does come a risk, because then you are also opening yourself up for answering questions about the longer term Conservative record, not just your role as Chancellor. And then I think him talking about security in general, we've heard him talk about security before. I'm not sure that why the message around geopolitics and defence necessarily cuts through on the doorstep. I'm not sure people are going to vote on that. But adding to the mix that, look, the world is unstable. Do you really want to make another change and potentially ruin the small progress we have made? Again, that will be a consistent theme as well from not many choices that he has.
Very good to talk to you. Thank you very much. That's Mo Hussein there, the former Downing Street advisor. I'd like to go now to our correspondent in Glasgow, Lorna Gordon. Lorna, just looking at the election and what Rishi Sunak had to say, what sort of battle lines will there be in Scotland, and has there yet been any political reaction there?
I remember the last time there was a general election here in Scotland, the SNP won the most seats by a considerable margin. But I think it's fair to say it'll be a much more competitive general election this time around. Remember that Labour won this part of West Central Scotland, Hamilton, Rutherglen and Hamilton West in a by-election last year. They'll be hoping to win this seat again and other seats like it in West Central Scotland, east of Edinburgh, and perhaps as far afield as the Western Isles. Certainly the polling suggests that the last 5 polls put Labour on 36% here in Scotland and the SNP on 32%. That's only 4-5% difference, but it's how it affects the seats, and there are a lot of marginal seats here in Scotland. Labour will be hoping to wrestle them back from the SNP. The Conservatives, their response has been they're feeling quite confident. They'll be looking perhaps to gain seats in the north-east of Scotland as well. And it's a challenge for Scotland's new First Minister, John Swinney. He's just in post. He's had a new cabinet. Today he was setting out his priorities for government, and that has been swept aside with this news of a general election in July. He's going to have to get his head, he's going to have to get his party, and he's going to have to get his campaign in gear to hold on to those seats in Scotland. And there's a lot to play for here.
Yes, indeed. Thank you very much, Lorna. Let's cross now to Cardiff and speak to our correspondent there, Thomas Morgan. Thomas, this news of the election date, July the 4th, just made in the last few minutes. Has there been any reaction there?
Not so far. I think really, though, back in 19, when we looked at the fight here in Wales, I think the fight was focused almost entirely up in North East Wales, the so-called red wall seats there, and most of the voters there did actually switch from red to blue, and if the polls remain as they are, I'm sure it looks like they could switch back, really, and that is where many of the campaign, I'm sure, will be focused over the next couple of weeks. However, the makeup of those constituencies will be different, because in July 40 MPs in Wales do become 32. And what does that mean? Well, it means that in certain seats as well, Labour may be targeting some of the big hitters. For example, 3 former Welsh Secretary seats and the current Welsh Secretary seat may be up for grabs for Labour. The only seat that isn't changing is on the Isle of Anglesey, which today it was announced will be the next preferred site for a nuclear power plant across the UK. Now, of course, this is going to be a big election for everybody, and in Wales the focus will be on those key battlegrounds, as I say, but here in South Wales there has been some disquiet amongst the public, especially because the 20 miles per hour speed limit that is now going to be changed after such a backlash here in Wales. So how will that affect voting come July the 4th? And there also has been pressure on the still relatively new First Minister Vaughan Gething after the donation he received for his leadership campaign, £200,000 given to him by a man that was twice convicted of environmental offences. So no doubt the Tories will use those two things to attack Labour here in Wales. They'll also go after Labour's track record on education and health here in Wales, and the reverse from Labour will no doubt be, well, we're not receiving enough money from Westminster to fund those public services.
Thomas Morgan there in Cardiff, thank you very much. Well, let's cross now to Belfast and speak to our island correspondent, Sarah Girvin. And Thomas and Lorna both making the points that the First Ministers in their respective assemblies are relatively new. Well, that could also be said for Michelle O'Neill. What are the issues going to be in Northern Ireland, Sarah?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Northern Ireland's power sharing government is just up and running again for really only a matter of months after a 2-year hiatus. And as you say, Michelle O'Neill from Sinn Féin, the First Minister for the first time, and Emma Little-Pengelly, the Deputy First Minister from the DUP. We have just started to have a little bit of reaction from the political parties start to trickle through. We've heard from the DUP. They say the government was running out of steam, as they put it, and we've heard from the SDLP, and they've called this election Operation Remove the Tories. So they're making their stance very, very clear. And there are 18 seats, Westminster seats in Northern Ireland, just to remind you of that. And they are mainly split between the two biggest political parties here in Northern Ireland. So the DUP has 8 and Sinn Féin has 7. And as I say, it has just been up and running again, a matter of weeks. And when Stormont did come back, it did so with Sinn Féin as the biggest party, and they will certainly be hoping to recreate that success at Westminster, even though they have an abstentionist policy, which means that their MPs don't actually take their seats. And calling this election, well, it could definitely be argued that it's bad timing for the DUP. Back in March, their former leader, Sir Geoffrey Donaldson, stood down after being accused of rape, and he's now facing 10 other sexual offences charges, historical charges. He's denying all of those, but his solicitor did say today he will not be standing for re-election. Then there's a new leader of the DUP, Gavin Robinson. He's now facing just weeks into a new job, leading his party through a general election and also defending his seat in East Belfast. So as always in Northern Ireland, Reeta, lots and lots in the mix and lots to consider until the July the 4th.
Sarah, thank you very much indeed. Our Ireland correspondent there, Sarah Girvan. I've got Vicky Young still here with me, Deputy Political Editor. We're waiting for the Labour leader to say something, Vicky. Do you have anything?
Of course, we're waiting for that reaction. He has posted a video, and in it he says that give the Tories 5 more years and things will only get worse. Britain deserves better than that. With the theme change, I have to say it's somewhere a lot sunnier than it is here. But of course, this is going to be, a huge period of time for him. He has not led the party through a general election before. There will be scrutiny for his party and for himself like never before. And there will be a lot of pressure on Labour to say what they will do. They want this election to be fought on the Tories' record. The Tories want it to be really fought on what might happen next. And they want to put lots of pressure on Labour about what their plans are, whether they have detailed plans. But, things are, a lot of things need answering, a lot of things need fixing, and both sides will come under a lot of scrutiny about what they're going to do about it. And I think for Sir Keir Starmer being that far ahead in the polls puts a certain pressure as well, a different kind of pressure. But Labour are...
It's theirs to lose, to a certain extent.
It is theirs to lose, apart from the fact that if you look at the last general election result, Labour did so badly, they have a lot of room to catch up. They have to win over 120 seats they don't currently hold. And that's a lot. That is a lot of places they have to win in. They will look at the recent local election results and they will feel buoyed by the fact that they were winning in lots of parts of England, not just in the north, not just in the cities. They were winning in lots of other places too. But they also know that they can't be complacent. And that's been a message from them for months and months and months, that they are not complacent because they do understand how big a challenge it is going to be for them over the next few weeks.
Vicky, thank you very much as always. Vicky Young, our Deputy Political Editor there. So if you happen to be just joining us, the news is that the Prime Minister has announced the date of a general election. But I'm going to take you now to Sir Keir Starmer, Labour leader.
Thank you. Tonight, the Prime Minister has finally announced the next general election, a moment the country needs and has been waiting for, and where, by the force of our democracy, power returns to you. A chance to change for the better your future, your community, your country. Now, it will feel like a long campaign, I'm sure of that. But no matter what else is said and done, that opportunity for change is what this election is about. Over the course of the last 4 years, we've changed the Labour Party, returned it once more to the service of working people. All we ask now, humbly, is to do exactly the same for our country and return Britain to the service of working people. To that purpose, we offer 3 why you should change Britain with Labour. 1, because we will stop the chaos. Look around our country. The sewage in our rivers, people waiting on trolleys in A&E, crime virtually unpunished, mortgages and food prices through the roof. It's all, every bit of it, a direct result of the Tory chaos in Westminster. Time and again, they pursue their own interests rather than tackling the issues that affect your family. And if they get another 5 years, they will feel entitled to carry on exactly as they are. Nothing will change. A vote for Labour is a vote for stability, economic and political. A politics that treads more lightly on all our lives. A vote to stop the chaos. 2, because it's time for change. Our offer is to reset both our economy and our politics so that they once again serve the interests of working people. We totally reject the Tory view that economic strength is somehow gifted from those at the top. Over the past 14 years, through all the crises we've had to face, sticking with that idea has left our country exposed, insecure, and unable to unlock the potential of every community. But a vote for Labour is a vote to turn the page on all that. A vote for change. And finally, 3, because we have a long-term plan to rebuild Britain. A plan that is ready to go, fully costed and fully funded. We can deliver economic stability, cut the NHS waiting times, secure our borders with a new border security command, harness great British energy to cut your bills for good, tackle antisocial behaviour, and get the teachers we need in your children's classroom. But most importantly of all, we do all this with a new spirit of service, country first, party second. A rejection of the gesture politics you will see in this campaign, I have no doubt, from the Tories and the SNP. I'm well aware of the cynicism people hold towards politicians at the moment. But I came into politics late, having served our country as leader of the Crown Prosecution Service. And I helped the police service in Northern Ireland to gain the consent of all communities. Service of our country is the reason and the only reason why I am standing here now asking for your vote. And I believe with patience, determination, and that commitment to service, there is so much pride and potential we can unlock across our country. So here it is, the future of the country in your hands. On the 4th of July, you have the choice. And together, we can stop the chaos, we can turn the page, we can start to rebuild Britain and change our country. Thank you.
So Keir Starmer, the Labour leader there, responding to the call of a general election here in a very wet Downing Street. Welcome to Westminster. I'm Geetha Gurumuthy. Let me just bring in Vicky, who's been listening in part to what Sir Keir Starmer said. He was in the dry, Vicky. Rishi Sunak, we just saw him a few minutes ago, absolutely drowned. But they were both repeating their messages on this huge, momentous day.
Yeah, they are both going to be putting out the cases and how they are going to fight this general election campaign. Now, for the Prime Minister, he's going to talk about security. He's going to talk about the work he did during COVID as Chancellor, how he helped people through a difficult time. And really, the Conservatives want to talk about the future. They want to talk about the plan they have. They say they've got a plan. It's starting to work. The economy is starting to turn around. Stick with us and it's all going to be okay. Of course, Labour want to fight this election on the Conservatives' record. They don't want to forget about what happened in Downing Street with Partygate. They don't want people to forget about Liz Truss. They want to talk about the Conservatives' record in power over the last 14 years, and particularly about the economy. But I think, Sir Keir Starmer, they have so far, Labour, played it very safe. They have gone out there and talked about trust. The Shadow Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, talks a lot about trustonomics. She wants people to feel they can trust her with their money. They feel that in the past,
as well,
that there's been a sort of, a problem with Labour and the economy, that they really do want to turn that around. So you can see here how this is going to be fought. With the economy, of course, I think at the centre of this.
And just let's talk a little bit about the drama of today, because it's very wet. This was the last moment, in a way, that Rishi Sunak could call it before the summer, before effectively the schools break up and the summer holidays begin. And yet a lot of Westminster seems to have been taken by surprise. I should say I heard a tip yesterday. There was a lot of speculation, but there's been so much speculation for a long time. But I heard diaries were being cleared, and the reason partly why obviously people are still so surprised is that the Tories are so far behind, 20 points behind in the polls.
Yeah.
What is the calculation of calling it now without waiting for some potential economic improvement in the autumn?
I mean, it is unusual for a Prime Minister who is that far behind in the polls to call an election when he doesn't have to. He doesn't have to do it now. He could have waited till January next year. And also the fact he didn't choose to do it in May. The big flurry was around the May local elections. It would have been the obvious time to do it on the same day as the local elections. And once that moment had passed, I think lots of Tory MPs thought, well, now it's going to be the autumn. They're going to hope that something turns up, hope that the economy starts turning around. And then that has all changed in the last couple of days. Now, good news today on inflation. And yet on the other side of it, a lot of speculation that interest rates won't now be cut in the summer as early as many people have been hoping. And that would have been something that the government would have hoped was going to happen, that people with mortgages would have started to see those bills coming down. But if they're not going to, then it raises the question, well, what are we waiting for? We're waiting for flights to Rwanda, maybe. But what if those flights take off and then over the summer, more migrants come across the channel? It will look like it hasn't worked. So there was a lot of jeopardy in waiting, as well as hoping for something to turn up.
Vicky, for now, thanks very much indeed. Well, we are joined by Charles Walker, Conservative MP. Mr. Walker, thanks for joining us. Your reaction to today's announcement?
Well, I was surprised. I have to say, we heard rumours in the tea room, but that's from Monday, but that's what we thought they were, just rumours. And it was really only this morning at about 10:30 that these rumours began to sort of gain some purchase with colleagues. And here we are, just after, 5:30, nearly 6 o'clock, looking at a 6-week general election campaign.
And are you standing?
I'm not. No, I announced well over 2 years ago that I wasn't standing, but I spoke to the candidate who's fighting my seat for the Conservatives and wished him the best of luck just before coming on air with you.
And obviously, just to ask you about the drama and the optics of the moment, obviously, as you know, it's a very wet day.
Yeah.
Even the Prime Minister can't control the weather, of course. But in terms of how this is going to look to voters, turning on the news, looking at a very, very, soggy Prime Minister, frankly, standing out here for quite a few minutes making that address, is that a good way to kick off an election campaign?
To be honest, most of it will be forgotten. It's a 6-week campaign. It feels very immediate now because it's just been launched, but there are rhythms to general election campaigns. As you rightly said, the Prime Minister can choose the date of polling, but he can't choose what's happening on the weather front. So look, this is the first of 42 days. And there's going to be lots of ups and lots of downs, both for Keir Starmer and Rishi Sunak. I mean, it's the political fight of both men's lives. One wants to stay in number 10 and one wants to get the keys to number 10. So it's going to be a fascinating 6 weeks.
Does really want to stay? Do you think he believes he can win this? Because the economy, some of the numbers, the inflation numbers today indicated, things potentially improving. Energy prices might have been coming down in the autumn. That is why so many who'd calculated the Conservatives' best chance said October, November, surely. So, what is your sense for your fellow Conservative MPs who want to stay in the Commons? Is this date giving them the best chance?
He clearly believes, the Prime Minister clearly believes that now is the time to go against really good inflation figures. So he's made the decision. He would not have made this decision lightly, but he thinks this is the best window in which to fight a general election campaign. And we can argue about should it be November, should it be October, should it have been May, should it have been July, but it is when it is, and it's July the 4th. And that's the contest that my colleagues are going to have to fight. The starting gun has been fired, and people now will be getting their leaflets ready, looking at their canvassing schedules, clearing their diaries, getting ready to submit their nomination papers to the returning officer, and the campaigning started as soon as he appeared on the steps of Number 10.
And Mr. Walker, in terms of the key issues, the things that your constituents have been talking to you about, I know that you're not going to be fighting for your seat again, but what do you think are the key questions that the Conservatives can persuade people on?
So the Prime Minister said stick the course. We were battling against the headwinds of COVID. Then there was China pursuing zero COVID that placed inflationary pressures into the economy. Then also Russia's appalling invasion of Ukraine, creating an energy shock. And the Prime Minister is going to say, I was with you through those difficult times. The times were always going to be difficult. But I said, if I took these measures, and some of them were difficult, putting up taxes, for example, we would get back to a good footing again. And I think that's what I know that's what the basis of our general election campaign is going to be. I said we needed to stick the course, we've stuck the course, and now we're beginning to reap the dividends.
In a special programme, we'll bring you all the reactions.
Charles Walker, thank you very much indeed for joining us. And just let me update you on what happened earlier this afternoon, because we heard Rishi Sunak saying that he met the King and he met the Prime Minister at the Palace directly after a reception. The meeting lasted, according to a Palace source, that meeting lasted for about 15 minutes, and it took place on the normal Wednesday Prime Minister's audience in the usual private audience room. That's just a briefing from Buckingham Palace, the King, of course, in London at the moment. Let's listen now to Ed Davey, leader of the Liberal Democrats, for his reaction to today's announcement of an election.
Well, the Liberal Democrats are fighting a really strong campaign across the country, and in many parts of the country it is the Liberal Democrats who can beat the Conservatives. We're the only party who can beat the Conservatives across the blue wall. We're here in Surrey. Everyone knows the battle here is between the Liberal Democrats and the Conservatives, but in so many other counties and across the home counties in the southwest of England and many other places too, if people want to get rid of the Conservative MP, they need to vote Liberal Democrat, and they can get that local champion that will stand up for them.
Liberal Democrats will be very hopeful of winning some Lib Dem Tory marginals. Of course, they've been tight in the past, but of course the Conservatives have struggled in the polls recently. Let's get the latest also now from the SNP leaders, John Swinney.
First of all, I'm very pleased that we have an election date.